Now, this material is proleptic in many respects. It is something that I intend to be doing a lot of work on in the future. It's like I'm coming back to my old school and giving you another proposal, and it actually feels like that. The discussion is part of a long-term examination of Tamil oratory, both ethnographically and historically. And there are basically 5 main points, and then I'm going to jump into the material as quickly as I can. It examines, first of all, Tamil oratory ethnographically and historically over the past 150 years or so. Explores the deep links and cultural interactions and continuities between Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu during that period, what we might call Tamil cosmopolitanism. Thirdly, it seeks to understand the role of oratory in the formation of a singularly Tamil public sphere. Fourthly, most broadly and abstractly, it looks at the relationship between forms of textuality and sociocultural order, in particular, the infrastructural role communicative practice played in the production of modern social imaginaries, such as democracies, economies, public spheres, and so on. Finally, a key problem here is considering the vernacular modalities of modernity, that is, how modernity emerges in particular places with different forms based on pre-existing conditions. Now, the primary way that people have looked at this formation of the public sphere has been through print. And that's, of course, extraordinarily important, as Benedict Anderson so brilliantly describes it. And the way that even Chalapathy was just talking about it, the way people can imagine themselves as being a part of something much larger than themselves, that gets defined in a very peculiar way. But basically, this work that I'm trying to do is to look at the sort of quotidian, everyday ritual practices of the oratorical model, and how that also served to do something quite similar, but in a sort of in a ritual model that could also interpolate or address and therefore instantiate a public sphere of a generic sort that we come to understand as such. Now, I take for my principal problem in this paper the image of the vernacular preacher delivering a sermon in what he might consider a public space, the marketplace or bazaar, circa 1865. He does so deploying not only his Tamil Bible, but as vernacular Bible, but as supporting material, quote, native, unquote, texts. Prominent among them, the Nalariyar, or the Nalari Nanutru, and the Tirukkural, 2 of Tamil's most famous treatises of being in the world. The first task is to explain to you why I chose to forefront Nalariyar in this discussion and situate it in the bazaar. Nalariyar, the first reason is that it is a prominent text cited in H.M. Scudder's Bazaar Book, or the Kiranamalihe, also known as the Vernacular Preacher's Companion. Each address, writes an unnamed editor in the English introduction, contains woven into its texture a few poetical quotations selected with great care from Hindu works. The Nalariyar is the second and most prominent Tamil text cited in the Bazaar Book, second only to Tirukkural, and it is especially prominent in discussions on language. The Bazaar Book is among the very first texts to provide an outline of homiletic in Tamil and models of Tamil sermons, although individual tracts going back to the 1830s and 40s were similarly structured in theme and tone. With the exception of a brief English introduction, the Bazaar Book is composed of a series of 13 addresses to heathen audiences on such topics as guru, sin, God, man, expiation, fate, transmigration, idolatry, caste, Brahmanism, and importantly for our purposes, Shastra and Mantra. The Bazaar Book appears to have included a number of tracts that Scudder had been preparing when he took sick leave to return to America, but the tone of the address was very much in line with the rather aggressive and offensive style of tract publishing and preaching that characterized the Protestant missionary engagement with South India and Sri Lanka from at least the beginning of the 19th century. The tracts joined together in the Bazaar Book were very clearly meant to be read aloud to a group of people, perhaps memorized and delivered by native assistants or catechists. The addresses are written in an extremely simple Tamil, somewhat more Sanskritic than today's standard in Tamilakam. For instance, you get Sariram for body or Pulokam for earth. But the sentence structure is quite easy to grasp, quick syntactic punches, perfect for oral delivery. Other features of the orality of the text include direct address of the audience, Priyamana Varhale, or simply Janangale, terms which I do not think were common in many forms of oral discourse outside of or prior to the Protestant sermon. They included a great deal of rhetorical questions clearly designed to engage listeners in situ, and the language was shot through with very simple proverbs, similes, and other appeals to oral literature. Hence, though tracts containing precisely these kinds of sermons were printed in the 1840s, this book contains, I believe, the earliest systematic representation of direct address to plural audiences in the entirety of Tamil literature, and one of the clearest direct ancestors of the Tamil oration more generally. Secondly, Naladiyar, along with its far more famous companion and model, the Tirukkural, was the second Tamil text that we know of to have been printed outside of a Christian context by Tamils for Tamils in Madras of 1812. Its priority in the thinking of Tamil literati, at least, is indexed by its primacy in the order of publications, close to a Gutenberg Bible, then, as an index of the doxa of textual importance for Tamil people. G.U. Pope writes that the peculiar terseness and vigor of its style and the fidelity with which it reflects the thoughts and ideas of the great mass of the Tamil people, indeed of the yeomanry of India, leads it to be called the Velalar Vedam, the Bible of the cultivators. Its import is attested by the fact that Uve Saminadayar, one of the great rediscoverers and universalizers of Tamil literature, took it up as the very first lesson upon his appointment to the government college in Kumbakonam in 1880. And by 1893, in G.U. Pope's famous critical edition and translation, the author asserts that it was taught in every vernacular school in the Tamil country. As far as I can tell, it was also used among Christians from a very early date, included in the formal syllabus of the Americans in Jaffna, for instance, from the foundation of their seminary there in 1816, and mentioned as one of the principal texts in their second triennial report of 1830. Indeed, the Tirukkural, the Naladiyar, like the Tirukkural, the Naladiyar in its simple and apparently monotheistic moral counsel was and remains immensely attractive to Christians and everyone else for that matter. Even G.U. Pope, who worked zealously to purge the church of a great deal of indigenous aesthetics in the mid-century, endorsed the text wholeheartedly and wrote that the two together throw a flood of light upon the whole ethical and social philosophy of the Tamil people. Thirdly, though the Naladiyar is today not nearly as well known as the Tirukkural, its structure is noteworthy for its artifice, and therefore for what might have been important to Tamil speakers for a very, very long time. The text itself is of unknown origin, though most think it Jain, and many felt it to be among the earliest texts of Tamil literature. Pope cites an account by a recent editor of the text that gave its origins as a group of 8,000 Jain ascetics who I think I should skip that, but it's because it goes on and on and on, but they left behind 400 quatrains and mysteriously vanished. Traditional scholarly lore has it that prior to the 12th century, these 400 quatrains were organized in no particular order. It was reorganized by one Padamanar in the 12th century according to the well-known structure of Indic didactic text, that is the three paths of life, what I'm going to call being in the world, dharma, artha, and kama. To forefront the Naladiyar in the sermonic practice, then, is to forefront not only the new use of a native text, but one that is organized according to a much earlier and deeper pan-Indic aesthetic of human life. It embodies, in my view, a vernacularization, in Shulman Pollock's terms, of an even earlier metastructural set of concerns in the lives of Indian people, a set of concerns that's very old indeed. It provides, then, a perfect icon of the kinds of problems I want to consider here, that is, the ways that pre-existing pattern structures, practices, aesthetics, and so on, are taken up in new newnesses of modern textual forms. Finally, the Naladiyar is forefronted here because it tends to lend itself more easily to the Christian and peculiarly Tamil modern exclusion of kama from the public world. Visible genres of Indic performance would in previous ages forefront kama as an element of life in both oral and scriptural practices, as you all know. But of course, for the Christian fathers, could we get the next slide on here? And one more, please. And one more. There we are. Right. We don't see much comma here, or at least not visibly. And but it's interesting that it was something that they were attempting to sideline, and we see today that it has been, in some respects, sidelined in certain public forms, as opposed to, say, what we know happened 1,000 years ago or so in Ula Prabandham, as Blake could tell us, or other forms in which kama was forefronted. Today, it's marginalized to stigmatized forms of theater, as Susan Sizer has written, and street performances such as Karakartam. or to the realm of whisper and gossip among regarding the multiple partners or non-standard sexual practices of the political class. We do not see today, for instance, posters featuring the sexual prowess of the political leader or poems composed detailing the various erotic leelas of Karunanidhi, though these may very well be a part of talk about them in some quarters admiringly. I'm serious. While the Tirukkural, for instance, gives almost equal time to Kama, the Nalariyar leaves only 10 quatrains out of 400 for the subject of bodily desire. In this way, the Nalariyar, even above the Tirukkural, appears to embody a new kind of sexless publicity, which, of course, was the mid-19th century ideal. Now, the fact that Scudder cites the use of this text in the Bajar provokes a rather stunning and fruitful sets of conjunctures and contradictions. We imagine that Scudder had in mind a public place, one that he felt would be a place where he could address some generalized humanity, some group of zero-degree individuals, as Kaviraj would put it, all equal in the sight of God and all deserving of God's good news and salvation. But of course, and wonderfully, a bajar is not a public place in our understanding of the term in several distinct senses. It's not opposed to some private realm in the ways that the West understands the opposition. It's rather the very paradigm of what we've come to understand as one pole of a quintessentially Indic opposition between a ritually enclosed and therefore semiotically coherent interior and the exterior, a space markedly unmarked, not coherent. Dipesh Chakravarti has used the bajar as a paradigm which he says has a deeply ambiguous character. It's exposed and therefore malevolent. It's not subject to a single set of enclosing rules and rituals defining community. It's a place of mixing and miscegenation, feces, prostitutes, etc., etc. Now, the miscegenation is perhaps the source of its problematic and alluring quality. Discursively, it's opposed to an interior in several respects. And I think you folks probably know this literature, and I'm not going to go over it again. All I want to do is it's been pointed out quite powerfully by, in particular, folks like Dipesh, Partha Chatterjee, Sudipta Kaviraj, and others who have looked at this peculiar opposition between the interior and the exterior as not only structuring space, but also structuring the way we understand a much larger social order, such as Partha Chatterjee's famous notion of the interior as a realm of spirituality and feminine virtue, and the true Indic versus the exterior of bureaucratic control and colonial domination, something that he claimed the nationalists ceded to the West while maintaining this pure interior of spiritual virtue that becomes, perhaps we could say, iconically Mother India herself. But this is also really broad. We know this, we Tamilists knew this from A.K. Ramanujan a long time ago, the opposition between the Aham and the Puram, which he claimed was still operable as a vital category of socio-spatial opposition in Tamil Nadu. We know that it operates, as Diane Mines has recently talked about, I think following some of the work of, David Shulman, regarding the opposition between the Nadu and the Karda, the Nadu being the cultivated realm of the humanized world, and the Karda being that place exterior to that, which is incoherent and dangerous, filled with all kinds of unpleasant people, ghosts, and fascinatingly a past, dead folks, of course. But the what I'm trying to get at here is the way that the public, that say the Scudders imagined in the bazaar, is precisely not the case at all, that they fundamentally misunderstood what kind of a socio-spatial entity that they were entering when they did enter the bazaar in order to engage in that quintessential public act, which is to address Janangale, O my people, or Primanavathale, or of course Pavikale. Now, given the prevalence of this opposition is really quite extraordinary in its pan-Indic extent, stretching, we know from Claire Talwalker's work in the publics of Marathi, of course the Bengali, and here in South India too, a pan-Indic paradigm that rivals the public-private opposition and incorporates it in some respects in the imaginaries and practices of many Indians to this day. Now, to return to the Bajar of the Bajar book, and I think I only have a few more minutes left, and I'd like to use it just to give a taste of the way that Scudder used the Nalariyar in the Bajar, because it's really quite pointed. Just over half. Remember, it's the second most prominent text he's using in a text that's mostly, quote, native texts that rival the Bible itself. 9 out of the 16 of the nullities are found in a final section entitled Various Topics, all but 2 of which are deployed in a subsection entitled Street Opponents, Unfair Disputants, and Cavillers. And reading through them gives us a sense of the general tone these sermons may have met with in the altogether non-polis-like atmosphere of the Bajad. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah. Here, the vernacular preacher offers Nalariya 26:6 to the noisy disputant. And it's significant note that he's using the palmyra as an image, which is the quintessential sign of the carda, versus which grows in a carda even when cultivated. Nalariya 26:6. No sound comes from the green leaves of the palmyra tree, but its dry leaves rustle noisily evermore. So learned and wise men, fearing lest they be betrayed into faulty expressions, keep silence, but ignorant men are always jabbering. To the abusive disputant, Scudder suggests the use of 3 naladies, including the senseless as a ladle, which knows not the sweetness of the gruel. Empty-headed fools ridicule the words of loving men who discourse graciously on virtue. The wise, however, accept those words as full of substance. Or naladi 6:8. It is the duty of great men not only to forgive abuse cast upon themselves, but also to grieve, because their vilifiers must, as a consequence of their wicked conduct, fall into a fiery hell. And to the disputant who scorns and rejects truth, the vernacular preacher might deploy Naladi 26:9, which states that base and contemptible souls are like the fly, which passing by the honey distilled in perfume-breathing flowers, greedily seeks everything that is foul and disgusting. Of what profit to such persons are the clear and sweet words which drop nectar-like from the lips of the great and the wise? Now you recall, if anybody has read any of these kinds of sermons and tracts from this period, they are not honey-like things at all. They are not nectar and sweet. They are most aggressive and aggressive. Now, I think finally the following suggests the most carda-like qualities of the Bajada by offering to the obscene disputant a universally understood insult with a timing and denouement that strikes me as Tamil in the very best way. When fools who have failed to profit by instruction speak detestable words, wise and excellent men feel ashamed and greatly pity the mother who gave birth to those fools. Now, before going on, I think I'm running out of time here. I want to say that, of course, these are not these rather nasty and aggressive naladies are by no means to be taken as the general tone of the book, which is really quite astonishing and beautiful. As Chalapati noted to me a little while ago, it is a greatly underestimated text today. But it contains some extraordinarily beautiful verses embodying a timeless ethic with universal appeal. And I guess I have to stop at this point because I do want to make sure that I'm not. Yeah. Well, the conclusion is basically this. I'm trying to understand how it is that certain kinds of Protestant textualities, that is the sermon itself in this case, it emerges within a world in which in which the Protestant forms of textual production, both in terms of the social relations of the text as well as the available interactional genres, utterly transform and are really infrastructural in the transformation of the public sphere. I mean, take, for instance, social relations of the text. When he's saying Janangale, Priyamanavathale, he's really addressing a generalized audience, and this is unheard of at the time, as far as I understand it. Texts in general were quite restricted in their social use, versus this, that is, it would be incumbent upon someone to be of a particular caste and have a particular lineage, have a particular training to be prepared to receive certain texts. The text would have to be done within a particular place, like a temple, or another place that is, or a court, someplace that is not open to all in a public fashion. There's also a sense of the transformations and the embodiment of textuality that that the Protestants brought with them. The difference between the memorization of texts versus synthetic learning. recitation versus exposition, what you might call a textual emblematization that involved the consubstantiality of the person who memorizes the text and the text itself, versus an analytical discourse which demonstrated the ability to contextualize arcane writ into the lives of contemporary folk. It involves a different phenomenology of textual rationality, indexing what Kaviraj and others following Weber would call cognitive modernity. Science, for instance, gets taken up in the way that they're using these, in the way that they're educating folks, obviously, in entirely new educational structures. What the Jaffna kids would immediately recognize when I asked them the difference between a Parachale Palikuram and a Tinnai Palikuram. Something that was like this, as a matter of fact, versus something in which the teacher would exemplify a text, would recite a text, and other folks would repeat it back over and over until they've learned it. And it resulted in what we can only call a communicative revolution, and Jaffna is the site where I'm really looking at this happening in the 1840s, of three kinds of institutional forms that came to character, that were what I believe were entirely structured or tracked by these Protestant textual ideologies and phenomenologies. Schools, or Parachalak Palikurangar, as opposed to Tinnai Palikurangar, presses, in order to propagate the Bible itself, and sermons, something that's often quite forgotten in all of this. And I'm gonna leave it at that, except to say that the larger conclusion of this particular long, winding paper is that we can see certain kinds of what we sort of as means of textual production, both artifactually within institutions, as well as generically within genres of performance like sermons, as having this infrastructural quality of the Tamil public sphere. However, there was something that was left over, or something that was inherent, what we might call an embodied ground of textuality that the Protestants had to work with, and that was the poesy and the rhetoricity of these texts. And these are the things that were brought along even by the Christians themselves. That is the very feel of the language, the meters of the language, the rhetoricities, that is the topics and strategies of persuasion and so on that they brought with them, that gave the entire project a different embodiment. So it was structured by larger, by these artifactual and interactional forms of textuality, but it had a Tamil soul insofar as it maintained or preserved both rhetorical and poetic forms. And I think that's it. Thanks.
Tiger in the picture, from an image which appears in one of Salma's poems, the last two verses of which go like this in translation. We read this morning, but I'll read them again. More bizarre than the early hours of night is the hour past midnight when dreams teem. It is now at this midnight hour the tiger which sat quietly within the picture on the wall takes its place by my head and stares and stares. Salma's novel Rendam Jamangalin Kadai was published in 2004, by which time she was already established as a poet. She belongs among the younger women poets who suddenly came into prominence, both in Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu in the 1990s. But as Chalakpati was saying, she stands a little apart from her contemporaries, like Malati Maitri and Kuti Revati. Her poems were immediately striking for her themes. She explored the paradoxes of loneliness and isolation within the Tamil Muslim joint family, the clamor and the silences within the most intimate of relationships, her longing for privacy and a true solitude. She wrote with a bleak truth about the sexual contract within an arranged marriage, about a troubled motherhood, about the besetting dreams, desires, and demons of the dark hours of night. She wrote in a terse style with an intense, almost unnerving stare of honesty. Some of her best poems are built around a single striking image or a pair of contrasting ones. Even her long poems are often made up of linked images which alone convey the logic of the poem. One of the most startling of her images is the tiger, which comes at the end of the poem I've just quoted. The poem, by the way, which carries almost the same title as her novel. This is one of Salma's longer poems. A woman speaks bitterly of a relationship which has no life left in it. Her husband, whose own body is unblemished, however many women he might have impregnated, no longer desires her, now that her beauty is gone, her body marked and marred by childbirth. But then comes the surprising ending and the startling image. In the hours past midnight, teeming with dreams, Kanavukal Perugum Rendam Jamam, the tiger descends from the frame which contained it to sit by her head and stare at her. The tiger is the challenge. The tiger is the dream. What will the tiger do? And what will the woman do for her part? The novel, in a way, sets out, it seems to me, to answer these questions. Salma's apprenticeship as a writer is through her poetry. And it is perhaps significant, and this again Chalapati was saying, that while there have been a number of women poets writing in Tamil in the 1990s, there have been few new women novelists in the sense of writing lengthy fiction. Ambai, C.S. Lakshmi, of course, has been a strong literary presence since the 1980s, but her beautifully crafted work is in short fiction. Bama came into prominence in the 1990s as an important Dalit voice, but her best work is more in the nature of personal testimony than fiction. So Salma's antecedents, I would be bold enough to suggest, are Topil Muhammad Miran's Oru Kadalora Gramathin Kadai, The Tale of a Seashore Village, 1988, and Sundar Ramaswamy's Kurandehar Pengal, Angal, Children, Women, Men, 1998. Now, when Topil Muhammad Miran's novel was first published, it was hailed as the first of its kind, a modern novel which was set in a Tamil Muslim village and which describes quite uncompromisingly the religious and cultural life of its characters. But its interest is more than anthropological. Miran's novel is set in the 1930s or so. It's a historical novel, and the thrust of it is social and economic change, seen through the downfall of the feudal landlord Ahmed Kallu Mudaladi. Its concerns are contemporary and modern. The symbol of change is the coming of an English, and so by definition, secular school to the village. However, what is also of particular interest to us is Miran's uncompromising use of a Tamilized Arabic in all cultural and religious contexts. Not that these make the novel opaque, but there are enough there. And he also uses a spoken dialect close to Malayalam. Of course, he glosses some of the words he uses, but generally, he trusts his readers to find their way in the novel's world. And in this, he certainly sets a precedent for Salma. But Rendam Jamangalin Kadai has a much wider canvas, a far more complex plot, and more inward characters than Oru Kadalora Gramathin Kadai. And in this, I believe, all this Salma learns from Sundar Ramaswamy's last novel, Kurandehar Pengal Angal. Salma's novel, too, tells many and interrelated stories, as Sura's does. And although the backstories of some of the characters go back a generation or two, the actual time frame within which both novels operate is a single historical year. In Salma's novel, it is 1983, by the way, the year of civil war in Sri Lanka. As well as this, both novels are held together by the connecting story or perspective of a young child whose radiant innocence is set against other and darker lives. 9-year-old Balu, in the case of Kurendehel Pengel Angel, and 12-year-old Rabia in the case of Rendam Jamangilin Kadi. Now, although Salma tells the stories of many women, there are three main threads that run in parallel but also enmesh to shape the book. The first is that of Rabia, who's in her 11th or 12th year. This is the year she begins to be aware of first love and of her own sexual awakening. This is the year she stops going to school and her childhood comes to an end. The second main story is that of Wahida, Rabia's cousin, her father's elder brother's daughter. This is the year Wahida finishes school and returns home to her parents. This is the year she marries, becomes pregnant almost immediately, and is trapped within her marriage. She is 18. The third story is that of Firdaus, Rabia's young aunt, her mother Zora's younger sister. Firdaus, the most beautiful of all of them, is also the most tragic. She has left her husband, having insisted on a talaq, a divorce. She has an affair with a Hindu man, Shiva, is discovered and forced by her mother to kill herself in order to save her own and her family's honor. The insisting images of framing walls, enclosed courtyards, gates and frontiers, spaces that are allowed and spaces that are forbidden, follow Salma's poetry into her novel. Rabia has the freedom to run in and out of many houses, not only the houses of Muslim friends and relations, but those of her Hindu friends too. But she knows her days are numbered. She knows there will be a time when she will not be allowed to cross the threshold of her home without permission. She already knows about the importance of the gate in another context. Her mother has told her about shutting the gate against the gaze of jealous onlookers and of opening it to beggars and supplicants. Wahida, at 18, is trained to remove herself from the hall of her parents' house as soon as strange men enter the gate and cross the threshold of the house, changing it into a male space. She has always sought refuge in her own room, but when she is married, she realizes that she will never have a space of her own. The bedroom she shares with her husband is forever. Salma writes, hereafter, this was going to be her room. Hereafter, her happiness and sorrow, all the good that was to come and all the bad would happen here, within these four walls. And nothing would happen to her which these four walls did not witness until her dying day. She escapes only in the hours past midnight when her husband Sikandar is asleep, and she walks out into the tiny terrace adjacent to their room. Here she faces her demons. From here she sees Firdaus stepping out from her house into the forbidden street and entering the forbidden house of her lover. Now, Firdaus, the third woman, returns after her divorce to her mother's house, the mansion built by her doting father, Ismail, for her mother, Amina. She returns to the huge, empty house, an entirely enclosed female space, since it is now occupied only by her mother, an impoverished widow. Amina, aware of Firdaus's vulnerability as an extremely beautiful young woman who dared to insist on a divorce, literally locks her daughter behind the heavy wooden doors of the main house when she goes out. The enclosed garden and the terrace is all she's allowed. The claustrophobia of Firdaus's life echoes some verses from Salma's poem, which again we read this morning. Houses risen high within their cages, extend themselves only to frighten me. In this garden, enclosed within four walls, there is no shade to sit. The open spaces of the roof terrace secure no privacy either. There is no chair anywhere where I can sit and swing my legs. But it is Firdaus, under the tightest of strictures, who takes the most risks. The house her father built is separated from the kitchen block by the open courtyard. The gate to the house is set into the wall protecting the courtyard. Firdaus uses the architecture of the house to her own benefit, leaving the gate open when her mother is inside the main house asleep. She dallies at the forbidden frontier, then crosses it when the time comes. Salma's use of images of enclosed and allowed spaces, of frontiers and forbidden crossings in her poetry and her novel is like the notion of the harem within, which Fatima Mernissi develops in her book of the same title. In Mernissi's memoir, her grandmother, Yasmina, explains to her that the word harem, and I quote, was a slight variation of the word haram, the forbidden, the proscribed. It was the opposite of halal, the permissible. Harem was the place where a man sheltered his family, his wife or wives, and children and relatives. It could be a house or a tent, and it referred both to the space and to the people who lived within it. Yasmina goes on to explain to the young Fatima Mernissi that a harem, therefore, is also about private space and the rules regulating it. In that sense, it does not even need real walls. Yasmina says, once you knew what was forbidden, you carried the harem within. You had it in your head, inscribed under your forehead and under your skin. Rabia, in Salma's novel, is being taught as a young girl to internalize the rules. Wahida at 18 has already done so. Firdaus never learns to do that. When Wahida sees Firdaus enter Shiva's house and confronts her, it is Wahida who feels the horror and the shame of it. Firdaus never feels guilt or remorse for loving Shiva and sleeping with him, only regret that she is forced to die. Salma establishes the world outside the confining walls of the house in various ways. Rabia's perspective is important in establishing the contrast between the house and the village outside its gate. She's very much an outdoors child, and the physical landmarks of the village are all experienced through her perspective. The madrasa and the mosque, the road to the library, the school and the playground, the hills beyond the school. She climbs trees, picks fallen fruit and flowers, observes birds nesting, and the squirrels at their play. But this delightful open world of play contrasts with the tightly drawn community, strictly outside the house, but still an extension of it with its own invisible wall and frontier. The center of that community is, of course, the mosque, where the Quranic school is lodged, where the Hazrats congregate, and from where the Modinar raises the call to prayers every day. It is significant also that Salma's time frame for the novel has Ramzan as its centerpiece, for it is at Ramzan that the community is drawn together most closely and regulated by the rhythm of the communal fasting and special prayers. It's at the mosque, too, that the Jamaat decides on punishments and exclusions, protecting the honor of the community as a whole, which reflects the honor of the family. Now, while the novel is so much about enclosed spaces, therefore, the contrast between the home and the world outside is suggested all the time. The world of women is all the more claustrophobic because of the absence of so many men from the community who work abroad in Singapore, Sri Lanka, and Saudi Arabia. The impact of this outer world is felt most of all when some of the young men return as zealots, self-styled jihadis, anxious to connect the Tamil Muslim village to the larger community of Islam. Suleiman, the reformer, claims Tamil Muslims have lived too long among Tamil people and taken on too many of their customs, such as taking dowries from the bride's family instead of sticking to the custom of meher alone. For him, the orthodoxy of Saudi Arabia is the norm to be aspired to, and to belong to that wider Islamic community means, paradoxically, closer frontiers for women. And just as the contrast between the home and the world is ever present in the novel, so too is the contrast between night and day. As the title implies, this is a novel that is largely about the demons and desires that walk in the night, terrible secrets that shadow a family, about the jinns that are unpredictable. The jinns are supposed to be tied up and held captive during the month of Ramzan, but old Nurama hears them, nevertheless, forever rolling the barrel of gold coins away from her. By contrast, the day is regulated by prayer times and by the rhythms of work and play. And just as it belongs essentially outdoors, Rabia's story belongs too in daytime, even if it begins at dawn on rice pounding and other making days, and at the pre-dawn sahar meal on fast days. It is Rabia's story that frames the novel. It begins with her at school, watching the rain, and then walking home with her best friend, splashing through the puddles. It ends with her returning from the school she has left already, parting from Ahmad, her first love, and entering her home to confront the new wall that is being raised through its center. The ending of Rabia's innocent childhood is the thread running through the novel and holding it together. Now, in this last section of this paper, I would like to focus on the language and style of Rendam Jamangalin Kadi. And there are three aspects to Salma's polyglossic use of language that I just want to touch upon. First, it is full of vivid phrases and idioms reflecting a local use. And I'll just give you two quick examples. When Kani Rautar finds a wealthy son-in-law for her daughter, Amina, the whole village is jealous of his good fortune. The term that Salma uses for good fortune is puliyankombu paathu piditadu, literally grabbed hold of a tamarind branch laden with fruit, presumably, at the right or opportune time. My second example is the wonderful description of a girl as podum ponnu, literally the enough girl. Salma explained to me that if a woman delivers a series of girl babies, the belief is that if the latest girl is named podum ponnu, the enough girl, the next child will be a boy. So there are these lovely idioms which flavor the novel. The next important aspect is the language spoken by the women amongst themselves when they are gathered together in each other's houses. I should explain that these gatherings work as set pieces, devices that Salma uses to introduce new characters, to link one story to another, and to move the plot along through natural comment and gossip. This kind of chatter also contrasts with the intensely personal stream of consciousness method she uses to tell individual stories. But these are also occasions when some of the women are free to use a language that is bawdy, full of double entendre, lewd suggestions, and references to body parts. A certain amount of license seems to be allowed to married women, whilst the young girls are forbidden even to look at their own naked bodies. The license, however, is contained. It appears to stay within the limits of language and apparently only invites the sharing of personal experience and intimate sexual details inside marriages. It is precarious, though, dangerously at the edge, and hints obliquely at what could, and sometimes does, go on outside seemingly respectable marriages. It brings to the surface the sexual frustration of women whose husbands work abroad, coming home for very short periods, once in 2 years or so. The most important aspect of Salma's language is, of course, her use of Tamilized Arabic for the conceptual framework of the book. Here I want to look closely at one important passage in the book. The little girl, Rabia, is being allowed to keep the fast for the first day of Ramzan. She's hugely excited by this and sits down to the sahar meal between her uncle Kader and her father Karim. She helps herself liberally to rice and sambar, knowing she must not eat or drink again until sunset time. Kader watches her for a while, then calls out to her mother, who's in the kitchen. Zora hurries out, pulls her sari over her head, and stands there to one side, half hidden by a pillar. Kader says to her, "What is this, Rabia's mother? You haven't taught this girl any of our practices, Parakam. His voice and his expression are dense with regret. He goes on, look at her. There's no cloth covering her head. What sort of practice is it, tell me, to eat without covering the head? She mixes up her rice all in one go, makes a complete mess of it, and then she eats. She doesn't seem to know the benefit of mixing it a little at a time just before each mouthful. See how many grains of rice are scattered round her plate. I don't even know whether she said her Bismillah before starting to eat. And this is the operative passage. Bring up this girl child with some ilmu. Teach her to respect adabu. Let her learn which things are said to be barlu and which are nabil. He spoke without pause, his voice sounding gentle and full of concern, while his right hand stroked Rabia's head affectionately. Now, Salma glosses, she has a glossary at the end of her book, and she glosses ilmu as kalbi, which the Tamil lexicon defines as studying or learning. It appears to be exactly the same Arabic word, ilm, which, according to my friends Arshia Sattar and Ruxana Ahmad, whom I consulted, means learning, or more specifically, book learning, schooling. Now, no one in Qadar's family, except for Rahima, his wife, Rabia's aunt, is keen on formal education in the school-going sense. Here, Qadar presumably means Rabia should be educated into the precepts and practices of Islam. Arshia also reminded me that an alim refers to a learned person who's also wise, gentle, and knows what to do in all situations. And this is exactly how Qadar wants himself to be considered, both in the family and in the community. Salma glosses adabu as nallorikam, and Tamil lexicon defines it's a very difficult word, of course, orukam. Good conduct, morality, virtue, decorum, acting according to established rules and customs. Adab in Arabic seems to have a similar range of meanings, good conduct, but also etiquette and good manners, all of which Qadar presumably means. So Qadar is instructing Zora to bring up her daughter as a good Muslim woman with the right knowledge and an understanding of good conduct. And I just want to say that perhaps it's significant that the words kalbi and urukam are equally crucial in Tamil culture and ethos. The words inevitably evoke two of the best-known Kural of Tiruvalluvar, branded into our consciousness, both of which seem singularly apt in this context. In Sundaram's translation, learn well what should be learned, and then live your learning. And Orukam Virupam Taralan, Orukam Uyirinum Ombapadam. Right conduct leads to excellence, and so must be guarded above life. Well, so far so good, ilm and adab, ilmu and adabu. It's when we get to the other words, barlu and nabil, that the passage becomes really complex. Salma glosses barlu as kadamai, duty, but she does not gloss nabil. The word occurs, though, elsewhere in the novel, for example, when Zora is saying a silent nabil prior to the evening Tarawih prayers said congregationally by the women at Ramzan time, or when Wahida repeats 3 nabils as she washes her sheets after having had sex. When I discussed this passage with Salma, she explained that all actions were categorized into 3, those that are compulsory or barlu, and this includes avoiding that which is haram or forbidden, those that are optional, which the pious might do, nabil, and those that you might aspire to, sunnat. It is to be noted that Qadar actually doesn't mention sunnat here, but clearly it belongs with the other 2 categories in Salma's frame of reference, since she mentioned it. Now, I'm obliged to Arshia again for putting this into context, Salma's 3 categories. Once she had worked out the sound shifts by which Arabic words were Tamilized. And I quote from what Ashia wrote. In namaz, she said, there are 3 categories which apply equally to all 5 times. Farz, Tamil Badlu, the prayers that you must say no matter what the circumstances. Nafil, Tamil Nabil, those you might say if you're pious. And Sunnat, those that the Prophet prayed always. And she goes on, there are several longer and shorter prayers that comprise any moment of namaz. So there are mandatory ones, the recommended ones, and the aspirational ones. So Qadr here is using the stages of the namaz as an analogy for the behavior of a good Muslim. Things that you must do, things that are recommended, and those that you might aspire to doing, because they will make you more like the Prophet in all your actions and thoughts. And thank you, Ashia, for that. The importance of Qadr's words to the conceptual framework of the whole book begins to be clear. His program is for Rabia, the pupil, but is addressed to her mother, Zora, who must teach her. It includes right learning, right conduct, the prescribed prayers, and right actions and right aspirations. Zora indeed watches over Rabia the whole time. When Rabia does her own forbidden deed, she goes off to the cinema during the month of Ramzan. Zora beats her for the first time in her life. Rabia sees her mother's anger and pain and is anguished, but this is how she learns. By the end of the book, she has internalized what the Hazrats at her madrasa have taught her, that the invisible malak sitting on her right and left shoulders will be keeping account of each of her good and bad deeds, and that it will all be reckoned on Judgment Day. It's against this pervasive moral framework with its complex set of rules that Salma places her characters. But Salma's characters, all of them, have hopes and desires and individual wills. It is not surprising then that most of the women characters in Rendam Jamangalin Kadai have erred, crossed the frontiers, or done something forbidden, and therefore have to confront their secret selves in the small hours of the night when the tiger descends from the picture on the wall. More bizarre than the early hours of night is the hour past midnight when dreams teem. It is now, at this midnight hour, the tiger which sat quietly within the picture on the wall takes its place by my head and stares and stares.
In any case, I seem to have a kind of strange karmic connection to this novella, and that's because of somebody who actually I would like us also to remember today, along with my dear friend Norman Cutler. That's a woman whom some of you may remember, Abby Zifrin. Abby Zifrin was a student of mine about 25 years ago at the University of Wisconsin. She was a true aficionada of modern Tamil literature and had an expert's knowledge of it. She died very young, tragically, at the age of about 51. And she had actually prepared a draft translation of this novel by G. Nagarajan, which she left unpublished at the time of her death. And I, for various reasons, sort of inherited this draft, and I feel that I have a kind of duty to publish it in Abby's name. It still needs rather a lot of work, but in any case, this is a project which I have taken on together with Ramakrishnan in Chennai. And so by now I've actually read the novel several times, and little by little it's actually sort of thrown its own particular charm upon me, and I'll try to explain to you why that is. I'll say a few words about Nagarajan, who in a way is a rather marginal figure. In fact, I called this talk Beyond the Margin. I'll try to explain to you why I called it that in a moment. He was born in 1929. He died in 1981. Basically, he drank himself to death. Actually, it wasn't only alcohol. It was all other kinds of substance abuse and general kind of very dissolute lifestyle. So he too died very young. He was born in Madurai, lived most of his life in Madurai and Tirunelveli. He taught at the American College in Madurai. I don't know if anybody remembers him still there, but for some years he taught there. He was closely connected with the Communist Party, and he suffered because of that. Eventually he became disillusioned and left the party. Began publishing short stories, and then eventually this novella in the 60s, 50s and 60s. Actually, when he died, the corpus that he left behind is not very big. This is more or less it. We have no 600-page novels, no 5,000-page novels. It's a rather small corpus, which includes this one novella, a few short stories, a few plays, and then there are several unpublished works, including an English novella called "With Fate Conspires," which I haven't seen, but it would be you probably know it, Telepathy. So, in any case, that's about it. Although the actual corpus that survives is very small, the man obviously had a tremendous impact upon his contemporaries. That is, people who knew him must have been amazed by something in the man. And one reason that we know this is that he left. That we know that he left this kind of impression is that there are 3 short stories actually about him. One by Sundara Ramaswamy, one by Asoka Mitran, and one by Dilip Kumar. The one by Dilip Kumar, which I think is the best of them, actually a very beautiful lyrical story. It's ostensibly a short story, but really it's a kind of memoir. And I want to tell you a little bit about this short story before I go on to talk about the novel. It gives you a picture of the man. Dilip met him for the first time, actually, about 2 months before he died in 1981. And he describes this meeting. Nagarajan comes to the offices of, he doesn't tell us, it's obviously the offices of Kriya, the old offices in Rayapeta. Dilip is a very young person working in the office. He's only published a few short stories at the very beginning of his career as a writer, but he's corresponded with Nagarajan, never met him until this moment. Nagarajan arrives one evening towards nightfall. He arrives in a very shocking state. He's a kind of derelict. He's a person in a very advanced state of both physical and psychological or spiritual disintegration, one might say. He comes. Actually, Dilip has been doing the accounts, and he's come up against. There's a missing 5 rupees in the accounts that are troubling him. That's rather important. In fact, the story is called Ein Rupayum Arkasatte Kararum. Right? So 5 rupees and the man with the dirty shirt. Nagarajan in those days was sleeping in the streets, actually. Ramakrishnan, who knew him very well, told me how he used to give him clothes and money and so on. You have to remember those 5 missing rupees. That's quite important. In any case, a conversation develops, and it's a rather moving conversation, which tends in a kind of philosophical direction. And in fact, the man, I believe, Nagarajan, was in fact something of a philosopher and very widely read. So he says all kinds of rather interesting things, some of them rather beautiful. I'll read you just one short quotation. He says, "A person always stands bewildered somewhere between cruelty and love. He must be made both of fire and of blocks of ice. Somewhere between this fire and this ice, knowledge cries out in torment, flutters, braiding the two together, yet never completely able to complete this. Knowledge seeking to broker this interweaving, that's tarahe, broker this interweaving, is a lie, even if at first it seems to reject the 2 conventional categories of good and bad. It ends up shrinking back, then taking refuge in them. Knowledge can, in the end, do no more than make present to us ever greater and subtler forms of sorrow." So there are passages like this, a kind of long, ongoing philosophical meditation, which is punctuated by Dilip asking him very personal questions like why he's drinking himself to death and why he's ruining his life and why he hasn't published more and those kinds of things. And eventually it reaches the point where Nagarajan asks him for money. He wants 5 rupees, not coincidentally, in cash. And Dilip feels that he cannot give him these 5 rupees for obvious reasons. He says, "I can take you to the place where I eat. I have an account. It's the end of the month. he's a young, struggling writer, Dilip. At the end of the month, you can eat there at my expense, but I can't give you the cash, right, for obvious reasons. And Nagarajan is very offended by this, and they go back to their philosophical discussion, and he shows him at one point, Dilip, the same translation of L'Étranger, Camus' L'Étranger that Chelapati mentioned. This is Onion, early Kriya publication. And here again, rather movingly, Nagarajan, and again in this state of very total sort of dissolute disintegration, takes the book, and it turns out that he knows whole pages of the English version of L'Étranger by heart and can quote them by heart. So he reads the Tamil translation and remarks on how beautiful it is. And then he goes back and again asks for money, and eventually reaches the point where he actually becomes very abusive and then violent and slaps Dilip hard, and Dilip then actually hits him back. And again, after that, the discussions resume, and eventually he goes off into the night. And actually, finally, in the end, he does manage to get 2 rupees out of Dilip. He goes off into the night. And of course, the underlying implication is that the missing 5 rupees were very much in this same category, that he has come before and said things like, well, I know the manager, and put it on the manager's account, and at some point somebody actually had given him the other 5 rupees. And then he dies 2 months after that. It's actually a very beautiful and affecting story, a moving story to read, and it also shows you something of the atmosphere of the novel, the novella itself. So let me say a few words about the novella. It's about 100 pages long. It's not much fun to read. It's a very grim, dark text. It tells you the day, and shows you one day in the life of its hero, Kandan. Kandan is a pimp and a kind of small-scale thief, hustler, crook. Lives very much in that kind of marginal, liminal zone. He wakes up, rather terrible physical shape. He sends somebody out to bring him arak. There's a kind of erotic flirtation with the neighbor's wife. After that, his own wife, who's a whore called Meena, comes back and they make love. Actually, there's a sort of brief, genuinely tender moment at that point, unique in the texture of the novel. He then goes out for his daily routine, which includes things like sitting in various taverns and bars. He procures a woman for a friend of his. There are sort of occasional picaresque meetings with truck drivers and various people who happen to cross his path. He goes to sleep in a brothel where he works for some hours. When he wakes up, he overhears a kind of pointless political conversation that has to do with the Communist Party and reforming society, very kind of neatly and ironically framed. It goes on like that with these kind of odd and rather inconsequential encounters, reported in a sort of strangely dissociated and disconnected way. And it finally ends up with a murder into which ostensibly Kandan, the hero, is kind of drawn in an unconscious way. Someone is murdered, a kind of violent quarrel is taking place. Turns out that the wrong man is murdered, we find out at the end, and then the police come. And you might think that the murder would be some kind of Aristotelian climax, but it's not. Actually, as soon as it's over, this kind of general dissociated kind of empty tone reestablishes itself. The police come, there are all kinds of bureaucratic technicalities, and he ends up in the police lockup at the end of the day. That's the whole, and the last sentence of the novella tells you that he's struggling very hard to remember all the things that happened to him in this day, and you can sort of see why that would be, because in fact they don't add up to very much. They have a kind of random quality that is, how shall I say, it's dissociated, it's sordid, it's a kind of sordid experience, and indeed amazingly kind of disconnected and grim. And in this atmosphere, by the way, things happen to the hero, Kandan, without him actually doing anything, it seems. It is as if he were kind of drifting through the day, and with certain things happen to him, but he seems to be devoid of any obvious agency. However, I do want to say that there is another way to read this novel, and you could read it, and I believe, in fact, Nagarajan hints very powerfully in this direction. You could read it in a very opposite sense, in a way, a kind of mode of extremely consequential, as if random set of actions leading to this murder, which could actually have been a murder that Kundun himself has planned and set up, except that it goes wrong, and the wrong man, very typically for this kind of atmosphere, the wrong man is killed. You can see it's a sort of grimly realistic text. Well, actually, I want to say something about that. It's ostensibly a kind of social realism. And yet, in a way, I think this is a kind of as-if realism. And I would want to call it by another name. I want to suggest the term of a kind of picaresque realism. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that in a moment. It's a very highly crafted world. Grim and difficult and sordid and dissociated, and yet there's a certain quality about the sheer intensification of this state that actually approaches almost a kind of mystical experience. So I'll say a bit more about that in a minute when I tell you what I think the novel is actually about. I haven't yet said that. I want to say, I mentioned Camus a moment ago. You know, there's a way in which this novel is a kind of existentialist, Tamil existentialist novel, right? He loved L'Étranger, we just said. He could recite parts of it by heart. It looks like a Tamil counterpart to L'Étranger in some ways, and especially in that, the way this kind of violent ending happens without the hero actually knowing what he's done, if you remember the Camus novel. So there's a kind of existentialist quality to it, and you know, what can, you know, if you take that seriously, it'd be very simple in a way to reconstruct the kind of text that Nagarajan must have read. Well, actually, it's not a great mystery. We know more or less what he read. He himself has told us about Camus, but we can also easily imagine that he read Steinbeck and he read Hemingway, and he perhaps read Baudelaire, and I'm sure he read the Russians. And by the Russians, I think we should also, here we should perhaps include somebody whom nobody reads today for the good reason that he's not a very good writer, that is Gorky. But actually, given the man's background, in fact, I could show you specifically that he's actually read Gorky. So there's all of these European texts. It would be easy to go, and I could talk for another 10 or 20 minutes about the European, let's call them influences upon this man. But in fact, I want to go somewhere else with this. See, I want to talk about the intertexts, because there's a kind of problem here, a kind of theoretical or methodological problem, I think, which I just want to put into the space of this afternoon where we're talking about modern Tamil literature. I want to make a distinction between the notion of influence, literary influences, the influences upon a writer, and the notion of the intertexts. See, I believe that the notion of influence is a trivial problem. Bloom's Oedipal, I don't think it actually is. It really seems to me to have no great interest to us. People read all kinds of things, and sometimes they're influenced, and sometimes they're not, and I don't think we can get very far by that. But the intertexts, that's a different matter. And I'm especially interested in the intertexts that the author himself may not have read. See, the problem of intertextuality, to use the big fashionable word, the problem that intertextuality allows us to address is precisely that. The notion that the literary culture is some kind of organic matrix. It's a growing, living organism. And it could easily be that the texts that we have not read, that a particular poet or writer has not read, are the decisive texts in his development, from our point of view, perhaps not from his, but from our point of view, from the point of view of people who want to write a kind of literary or cultural history. So if I had to list the intertexts for this book, I'm going to say 2 or 3 perhaps slightly wild things, but you'll have to bear with me, and then I'll tell you what I think the novel is really about. See, there's all the European sources that I just mentioned, and I could easily name others, and I forgot to mention Dostoevsky. He's clearly read Dostoevsky. I mean, you know, these are all there. They're all there. It's a kind of Tamil existentialist novel. But I think these are the least important intertexts, actually. And if I wanted to look a little farther back and to try to extend the boundaries a little bit of this modern literary continuum, so that we're not stuck only in the last 100 years, you know, to slightly expand the range of the voices that are somewhere within this kind of chorus, which eventually produced somebody like Nagarajan, a highly articulate, sophisticated, philosophically oriented writer. Okay, if I try to think which voices are there, which texts are somehow there within the matrix. So the first thing I would say to myself is that we actually have a literature of picaresque realism in the 17th and 18th and 19th century Tamil poetry. I don't want to belabor this point. These are texts that are not very much read anymore. But there are people in this room who have read Nondi Nadaham and Virli Virutudu and various of these so-called Citrilakiam genres. Paula has written about Pillai Tamar. Sasha has showed us the richness of the 19th century Tamil literary production, which still includes these works. If you wanted to characterize the Nondi Nadaham, if you wanted to read a text like this, Sidakadi Nondi Nadaham, or the Tiruchendur Nondi Nadaham, you would see a kind of picaresque realism, which is concerned with precisely these same kinds of people that Nagarajan was interested in. And you'll also see it as a kind of crafted, highly textured, intentional kind of production. Also linguistically there's a relationship. I don't want to go into that here. But although Nagarajan writes in what is ostensibly a kind of modern colloquial Tamil, very difficult to read in some ways, highly colloquial Tamil, as it were, reproduced on the page, in actual fact, it's not so close to colloquial Tamil, and it has that highly crafted, slightly artificial quality that these 18th and 19th century genres have. So we have a literature in 18th and 19th century Tamil about pimps and horse thieves and hustlers and that whole range of people that surface again in this novel of the 1960s. So that's one thing. Here's a slightly wilder supposition. The man grew up in Madurai, lived in Madurai and Tirunelveli. We have a literature, a folk bardic literature, about exactly this same kind of stratum, after all. There are people there. Some years ago, I wrote an essay about the catapulted Swami Kadai. And if you prefer to go further south, we have the Surulaimanam Swami Kadai. Again, these are bardic texts, and they're about people like Kandan. In other words, they're about sort of petty criminals, low-grade tricksters, who are managing somehow to survive, and that's their problem, to survive in a highly structured, hierarchical environment which privileges sort of certain specific kinds of people, So, I don't know whether Nagarajan ever heard the Katavaraya Swami Kadai. Perhaps he heard it as a child, I don't know. But even if he didn't hear it, it makes no difference to me because that literature exists and seems to me to be directly, or perhaps not entirely directly, but somehow linked to the kind of literary production that this man was engaged in. Now, I want to say that he himself might have been horrified to hear me say this. Horrified, because he probably thought he was writing in the great tradition of Dostoevsky and Camus. And in some sense he was, a kind of Tamilized version of that. I don't want to take that away from him. But I don't believe that that's the central intertextual component. Finally, I'll just conclude with one last intertextual possibility. And here you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to mention the forbidden word Sanskrit. See, I think this is a book about time. The very title tells you, right? Tomorrow is one more day. Abby initially wanted to call it, in the sort of English fashion, tomorrow is another day, right? But actually, the point is that tomorrow is not another day. It's one more day in an endless series of meaningless days. Time is completely undifferentiated for this man. Random moments of episodic violence may happen. Various things happen to him, but they very quickly subside into this undifferentiated temporal kind of continuum, you could call it. It's a book about a certain experience of time. There are different ways to describe that, and if I had more time, well, here we're talking about time, and I'm looking at Paula, so time, time has a for us, time has a sequential aspect, and I can see, looking at the clock, I have another 2 minutes, so I'll hold to that. But I just wanted to say one thing. If we wanted to bring to bear the tools of, say, 20th century literary criticism on this. So we have such tools. There's a very fine book which I recommend to you by a man called Weisskell, who also died tragically young. It's called The Romantic Sublime. He's interested in the English romantic poets. He uses the Jacobsonian categories of the metonymic and the metaphoric aphasia in order to describe two different temporal experiences in these romantics. So there's your metaphoric sublime, in which there's a kind of vertical substitution that goes on in a kind of pathological way. But what he calls the metonymic sublime is actually Nagarajan's kind of sublime. That's what he calls a contiguity disorder. That's the sense of on and on and on and on and on. There's no, just doesn't end, and there's nothing that breaks it up. Kind of, so that's one way. We could, if we wanted to, use these Jacobsonian categories. It would be, I think, a very apt description of Nagarajan. It's a kind of sublime, I said to you earlier, it's a kind of sublime, almost mystical state. Misery intensified to this kind of state. Misery, dissociation, disconnection, this sordid, grim kind of experience, which translates itself into a particular kind of temporal experience, Okay, so that's one way we could describe it. But there's actually a much closer intertext, and I believe it's the more relevant one. And again, it may sound a little strange in this company, but were you to read Bhartrhari, the 5th century philosopher of language, who also speaks very poignantly about time, in the Kala Samudesha, which is in a way the climax of his Vakyapadya. Bhartrhari tells you that actually time has no sequence. He says time is a kind of, what is time? There's something called time, but our experience of time, in the sense that this lecture has to come to an end in another few seconds, that's a projection of the mind, what he calls buddhya vagraha. Buddhya vagraha, the buddhi, the mind chops the world up into these little sequences. But actually, he says time is an undifferentiated mass. He says it in a very beautiful way. Tavan eva kshanakalaha yuga manvantranicha. That is, a single kshana, a single moment, and a yuga or a manvantara, they're all the same. They're all exactly the same. Now, there are different ways you could begin to talk about this. I'm fond of Bhartrhari, as you can see, and I'd love to go on for a long time telling you about it. But let me just say in conclusion that to me, the description, it's not a description, somehow the experiential evocation of temporality in this small novella is the most amazing exemplification I have ever seen of this Bhartrharian notion of an undifferentiated, endless, meaningless, seemingly meaningless temporal sequence. So I think I'd better stop with that. Yeah.
If I could draw together these three very different papers, I would be a miraculous person. But what I'd like to do is just suggest some of the interesting themes that seem to be occurring in more than one of these papers, and also telepathy, your talk as well. Just kind of suggest them, and then what I'd like to do is open things up for discussion. And can I ask you, when you ask a question, to identify one person or two people that you'd like to answer the question, just so we can move along and everyone can get a chance to ask their questions. I guess one of the things that I learned from today's set of talks is that the notion of modern or newness, or being mad about newness, the notion that there is this kind of abrupt rupture, perhaps it needs to be softened, perhaps it needs to be broadened, because I see a lot of things that have been portrayed as polar opposites, and I don't see them as so opposite. For example, in these talks, we've heard so much about Tamil in South India and Tamil in Sri Lanka. And we've learned that those contacts seemed to stop for a while, but they went on for a long time before that. And then again, they picked up again more recently. And I think that thinking about Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka and what kind of communication there was between these two areas before they were named Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka is something that I think is really important for us to do. I think that there's been a lot of discussion about the modern nation state and the institution of print, and I think that, Barney, your emphasis on oratory, not just print, is a kind of a useful corrective to that, so we see more of a picture of what's happening, because we know that in Tamil Nadu and other parts of India, oral narrative and oratory is something that that has a long history, and I don't believe that it just sort of dropped out of the whole kind of narrative discourse when modernity came. So we've got texts that are read, we've got oral texts. Genres, I think this really was the basis of my misunderstanding with you, Chalapati, because I said, well, there are these other Tamil Muslim writers, but they weren't writing fiction. They were writing poetry, and the fact that things like novels, that things like short stories, that things like essays came to have a different kind of, either they were new or they had a different valence, that poetry became a different kind of poetry. I think we need to see all these things not as, okay, here's a big rupture in the modern period, but that there were certain kinds of prose that were used before the modern period, but that the prose, the quality of the prose changed, the emphasis on fiction rather than other kinds of discourse, written discourse changed. I think that, again, Chalapati, you talked about the difference between popular magazines and little presses and how sometimes it was a big distinction and other times it wasn't. We need to keep that in mind, that these aren't always binary opposites. And then I also want to say something about something that I really don't know how to put it in words except to use a kind of a shorthand. Many Tamils, many kinds of Tamil. I think that so many of the things that people associate with the history of Tamil literature are often actually the history of Hindu upper caste males that are writing in a particular kind of form, whether it is, you know, a kind of a poetic form or whether it's a more modern form. But we have so many different kinds of Tamil that are in Tamil history. Just to give you an example, when Christians became Tamils, when Tamils became Christians, they transformed Tamil, not just the oratory, but the language in many ways. And they also were people who had a kind of a status in society that was high because of their education and their ability to get works published. We have other groups in Tamil, Hindus who actually renounce their religious affiliation, Muslims who renounce their religious affiliation and identify with political parties. We also have Muslim Tamil, we have Trichy Tamil, we have Kanyakumari Tamil, Tamil that is close to Malayalam Tamil, that's written in Arabic script. All these Tamils are actually not the Tamils that you find in those little Sahitya Academy histories of Tamil. And let's put them back in the picture, because I think that they were part of the picture, just like these genres were part of the picture. And I think if you put some of these things back in, instead of just identifying popular literature or modernist literature, you get a much broader sense of the kinds of writing that was going on, and Salma's writing becomes not something that's on the edge, but that actually is very much part of an ongoing tradition. Maybe there haven't been a lot of female Muslim Tamil writers, but there have been female Muslim Kannada writers, and Karnataka is not so far away from Tamil Nadu, and Mappala writing in Kerala is not so far away from Tamil Nadu. Something about the way our graduate education was structured, where you did Bengali or you did Tamil, and that was what you did, and then maybe you did Sanskrit or you did Persian, we were talking about this before, makes us in a way forget that these borders are fairly new for these states, that all the people who live near the boundaries of the states often have figured out a way to speak both Tamil and Malayalam, both Tamil and Telugu. Let's put those people back in the picture. And then finally, I'd like to highlight again the business of the fact that when we're looking at Tamil novels or Tamil poetry right now, we need to remember how much the translation has played a role in our understanding of these novels. Salma and I were talking about these Russian novels that were translated into Tamil. They weren't such great translations, but they had a great effect on many of the readers. We need to think about not just how writings get translated into English, but how the subject matter is presented. It may be at some level that Muslims in Tamil Nadu are a minority in Tamil Nadu, but if you put them in the framework of Muslim groups that live in Russia, that live in Tamil Nadu, that live in Kerala, you've got a much broader context in order to place these kinds of writings. So that was just to kind of suggest the extent to which this discussion should go, or could go, or may not go. And now I'd like to have people from the audience ask questions of the panel, and I'll try and get in as many as we can. Valerie, how much time can we have?
Lots of time. We have until 5:30.
But this is a good crowd for questions. So, okay, yes?
But in the spirit of what you just said, and actually using this concept that Professor Shulman brought forth of a kind of intertextuality without causality, I want to actually ask Barney a question that may not have otherwise been possible had Professor Shulman not laid that on the table, which is that there seems to be, in Sri Lanka, there seems to be another field of possible influence that would precipitate a kind of oratory or sort of modality about what you're presenting here, which is Dhammapada, or Buddhist preaching in Sri Lanka, Bana. And I want to just hear you, now that we have this opportunity to muse about intertextuality without having the burden of finding direct historical connections, which I'm not entirely convinced there aren't. I would like to hear you muse on that.
Happy to. Actually, are you talking about things like Dharma Desana and these in Sinhalese?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, it's public oratory.
Well, again, when I'm using the word oratory and then the word public, both of which I think have to be troubled a little bit. Oratory, I mean something very, very specific. I mean when somebody says, "Oh people, dearly beloved, Janangale, Avatale," this kind of thing. That is addressing a generalized audience. For a number of reasons, I don't think that it was particularly common. And even in Dharma, and I'm thinking of in Dharma Desana, the way that it was restructured by the time you had somebody like, I'm thinking of the Work of Kings, Senavaratna's text, and that he documents how the thing was really was radically restructured from a very long ritual process of recitation of text and various different kinds of moments of ritual action into something that looked very much like a sermon. Val Daniel has written about this as well as the restructuring of an earlier form, of an Indic form, into something that looked very much like a Christian sermon. This happens around the 1870s, 1880s. The same thing happens in Tamil around the 1840s and 50s with Adamohanabla, who does something almost exactly the same with the Tamil Prasangam and the Saivite temples of Jaffna. And it's even noted, you can go in Jaffna, you can see a place where there's a plaque that says, at this place, Adamohanabla gave the first Saiva sermon, Saiva Prasangam. There is a consciousness of the newness, of the new newness of this modality. And if I may, and so I think that the intertextuality that you're talking about is actually what one of the intertextual models that the Dharma Desana had would have been the Tamil Prasangam of Adamohanabla, who was challenging the Saivite, challenging the Christian, the Protestant missionaries in precisely the textual modalities that the Protestant missionaries had brought to them. That was the sermon and the sermonic form, and some things that looked exactly like Christian tracts, except that they were inverted, and Jesus was now bad, and Siva was now good. if I may just quickly talk about the softening, and I think you're absolutely right, which is one of the whole points, and it's perhaps clumsy yet. I think there are a number of different, I love David's notion of an intertextual organism. I think that might be a bit reified, but it nevertheless gets at something that we would want to keep, that this is not simply a radical break, except when people, there are newnesses of modernity, I think. I think there are something called a people does not exist. You have different kinds of people. A generic public sphere that involves a homogeneous empty time and space just doesn't appear to exist in the same way. And what I'm trying to say is that it is through various kinds of textual forms that comes into being. And and again, I want to be very clear. What I'm trying to do without being essentializing, because the trap is to say, lo, these many thousands of years, no, we want to actually see how the exact transmission from one moment to another enables a real transmission of a kind of an embodied ground of the sort that David is talking about, that there may have been other kinds of oral narratives that are operating that even if he's not, how can we imagine somebody in Madurai or who's traveled in South Tamil Nadu not knowing who Sudalai Mardan is? Of course not. I mean, of course he would know who Sudalai Mardan is, even if he'd not been a scholar of it. I've answered too much, but I think, yeah.
This might continue after the formal session. Okay, thanks.
Minor question. In fact, it's truly perhaps that since this novel is written about a Muslim village, a Muslim family in 2004, and I could see from whatever you presented that it shows the tensions between the tradition and the questions of modernity or women's freedom. But there is also reference, if I'm right, if I got it correctly, to the connections between the village and the newly emerging Middle East, the oil money. And is there any tension within the Muslim family or the community in the mosque or madrasa between the tradition, which is Tamil tradition Islam, and the new Islam, which might be coming in now? This is one. And the urge for freedom, what do you connect with on the part of women? Is it because of the village now coming and being exposed to the larger world? After all, there are also many other stories which are coming, because the Arab women are also all kinds of women, and Arab countries are also, the Arab country is not the same as Saudi Arabia. So is there any tension along these new things which might be coming into the village?
I think I will answer how these questions are affecting the novel, if you don't mind. I'm really concerned with the world of the novel, which is a fiction. And certainly the story, as Salma tells it, has these men who are living abroad, or several of them, and working in various places, Sri Lanka, Singapore, Malaysia, and Saudi Arabia. And she has these characters returning, and particularly those, in fact, the people who live abroad are always slightly alien. They bring back different norms, but in particular they refer to Saudi. And there is this one character she introduces, Suleiman, who becomes the jihadi. He becomes the reformer. He sets himself up as the protector of Islam, and he is always referring to Saudi as the pure, the best, but she does this. I have to say that in the novel, it's not something that Salma is pushing. She suggests this very subtly through this one character. It's not, the novel is by no means tap dumping, message pushing, or any of that. It's very subtly indicated. These changes are very subtly indicated. But certainly there is that element which she introduces. As to the women, as I said, she sets up this very complex moral world, and she sets against that these women, each of whom have an individual life, an individual will, and they live that out. And it's in pointing to that individuality that the question of fighting for a liberated self comes, or the conflict between what the rules say and what you want to do comes. And I think those are the important threads in the novel. But this is just I'm talking about the novel's world, not what is out there.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, can I actually just continuing on that, and I'm sorry if it's a little repetitive, but it's a question again for Lakshmi. In the world of the novel, I thought one of the most, it was really touching when you were talking about Rokkiah, the youngest son,
Yes.
who was really excited about getting the opportunity to observe the fast on Ramzan. And then, so we have that image, and then as you ended, with the tiger that's staring, the censorious stare. In part, what I was hearing Muzaffar saying, and maybe he wasn't saying that, but maybe I have it in my head, is this, in the novel, is this some kind of a staging or a tension between one kind of Islamic womanhood, if you will, something that the child was looking forward to, was excited about, which at some point will also have an erotic charge about it, and another one which is a little more distant, may have a similar kind of eroticism about it with all the money power that it brings, with people from working elsewhere, etc. But at the same time has more interdictions, has more restrictions, is more censorious. So is the novel, in your reading, or actually as you were writing it also, is it also playing out this battle between a new and an older version of Islam as it was practiced in South Asia, and also specifically in the context of this Tamil village, in the person of the female?
Yes. Let me look at this a little bit. You have many kinds of Islam, really. Even within this little village, as experienced by the women. You have the young girl and what she is expecting in the world to come. You have the slightly older women who are entrapped in a certain world and who want to experience their sexuality freely but cannot. And then there are the older women who are guarding the honor of the community very often. And the conflict is very often between those older women as much as with the reforming men. The older women who in the end are the most violent in wishing to maintain the honor of the community. And they're forced into that position. I mean, that's part of what she's saying, that the older women are forced into a position of having to be the guardians of the honor. And they're terrified. So all those conflicts are played out, really.
Can I add one more thing? The mother is also a co-conspirator, because on the one hand, she pretends to be ill to make her daughter so afraid, but then she takes the daughter to the book launch, pretending she's taking her to the hospital.
But sorry, if I might interrupt, I'm not talking about the biographical note. I'm talking about the novel, please, and that's what I would like to talk about. And there, the conflict between the younger women who wish to at least confront their sexualities is frustrated is indeed put down and denied by, not allowed by very often the older women who are most nearly conscious of it and who then put themselves in the position having to safeguard the honor of the community. But it's at all those levels of conflict that she builds up her moral world. I don't know if that answered your question.
I was wondering, as you said, these were talks of very different scope and genre, and I was wondering if there was one thing that resonated in my mind between them was the contrast between inside and outside.
Yeah.
That came across, and I was wondering if you could comment on this and if you think these are similar or very different sets of contrast. In Bonnie's talk, the bazaar is a kind of imagined outside, dangerous, wild area. In Lakshmi's discussion of the novel, in which the inside is a set of confinements within confinements, the last of which is the body itself within a kind of a prison, and the outside is a kind of a freedom that is not really possible.
Not entirely free either.
And in David's talk, Nagara's life and the life of his protagonists that are mostly in the outside with a very brief and anecdotal but interesting episode in the inside in the beginning. I think that these are like similar contracts or that they belong to different orders.
I noticed something similar, especially when Lakshmi was speaking. The desire, let me just say it this way, and it has to do with something I've thought about regarding the similarity and the non-similarity between the ummah, that is the worldwide community of believers, and the public sphere. That is a concept of a kind of a flat, homogeneous, empty sociality that can, be addressed and instantiated in the address. I was struck that the way that Lakshmi talked about, and it was really Salma, was talking about the desire to be more integrated with the ummah, as in the Saudi model of Islam. The community of believers paradoxically resulted in the greater cloistering of women within the interior. This is in many respects similar. I mean, it strikes me one of the classic examples of modernization, the gendered modernization and the formation of a new kind of national subjectivity in the public sphere is Bengal, and the way that Shumanta Banerjee wrote about the marginalization of women's popular culture in the 19th century, and the way this formed that a radical interiorization and the exclusion of certain sorts of women's forms from, if not public, at least visible and exterior spaces. So, for instance, Krishna Leelas and so on that he writes about. And I think it's really quite remarkable that certain forms of modernization, perhaps increased Saudization or Islamization of the Ummah, or rigidification of that in a globalizing fashion, along with the rigidified public sphere, is something that is paradoxically is precisely what we don't expect it to do. That is, it seems to categorize people more rigidly, especially in gendered fashions, and radically restrict their movement and their ability to speak. And so the formation of public spheres was also a radical masculinization of visible spaces at the same time. So I think there's something curiously congruent to that.
Can I add too that within the enclosed space, the women carve out a space where they can speak as openly as they can, where they push license as far as they possibly can. So there's that astonishing contrast in the inner space too. So,
but actually, in terms of it's interesting that it actually essentially marginal, right? He was interested in the margins. He actually lived in those margins in a kind of, it seems like a kind of premeditated way. But what I was trying to suggest is that marginality actually is not very marginal, right? I mean, he's actually making a statement which is really, in some sense, a kind of encompassing global statement. And in that sense, I think it's a little different.
Yeah, I think it's really quite different.
Because time has that quality for everybody, whether they recognize it or not.
Yeah. He actually talks about, I didn't go into it, but in the novel there's a very beautiful place where he actually talks about that experience of time and how one day, today and tomorrow, they're very arbitrary, meaningless experiences. And he's talking about experience, some kind of experience which is familiar, I think, to everybody. Right? So it's a funny kind of mixed space, right? Which I think is resistant to our, perhaps intentionally. So.
Unless, of course, it is this guy, how do they say it?
Yeah, Arrakasartakara.
I mean, he's somebody. It is that radical exteriorization that is the mark of his dissolution, which is also a space. But that's pushing it.
Just a quick note. It seems to me the border of this interior shifts, and the most the essence of it is the land. And then that shifts and imports to be rooted. I'm not a South Asianist, I'm merely a token South Asian. This field is totally different from my field. But when I was growing up, what we felt and lived in as my decision was real card. That was our lived decision.
Reading its hospital.
So it seemed to be the border of where the interior stops and exterior shifts. And just an amusing footnote to Barney's paper specifically, my maternal grandmother was Priscilla Scully. She was a Sri Lankan Tamil who was adopted by one of the scholars, who was first posted to the Enlightened Revolution and then posted to the American Bureau mission. So she was converted from Sargassum to Christianity, brought over to India, and she was their only child.
If I may respond to that, I think that you're absolutely right. There's a number of different ways that we can do the composition, including the way Val would do it, which is but it is another mood is being a very, a specifically organized space versus something that outside of that specifically organized space that there's all kinds of crazy stuff in it.
But when it comes to family, it's always related.
Real part, I think that's neat. And then the way that real also has that sort of, scalar quality. But the Scullers, I just want to footnote as well, were an extraordinary family who started Biennial Medical College, one of them, by the way, and did a number of major. I make a little fun. I poke a little fun at their beards and so on, but they are people of extraordinary accomplishment and contribution to Tamil society, and should be pointed out.
David, you had a comment.
I wanted to ask Barney something about the choice of Naladiyar as a proof text.
Yeah.
Because actually, your example is quite an early example. I mean, it tells you, first of all, it tells you something about what kind of Tamil texts were in the visible canon in the first half of the 19th century.
Right, very much.
It's important in its own right. Really and secondly, you could say that, well, the Naladiyar, what is it after all? It's a Niti text. It's a kind of Niti text, right? And there are many Niti texts. So why then did they choose the Naladiyar? Well, in a certain sense, of course, it's in a way, it's kind of the Tamil equivalent of the Bhagavad Gita in the North, in the sense that the Bhagavad Gita, as much as visible as it appears to us today, it seems as if it's an obvious choice for a major classical Sanskrit text. And actually, one could easily argue that the place of the Bhagavad Gita in modern India is a direct result of missionary choice, and the reason that they chose it, has a certain logic. Yeah. But anyway, my question to you is not that.
Oh, I was hoping to answer that.
I mean, you can answer that too, but what I wanted to ask you is whether you think it's possible that they chose the Naladiyar not merely because it was visible in part of the canon, but because, despite the use that they made of it, despite that, they were actually carried away by the immense lyrical beauty of the book.
That's the whole point, David. I mean, that's what I'm talking about an embodied ground of poesy, and I my paper is, I get to 2/3 of it. I mean, it just goes on and on at this point because it's trying to think through where I'm going to go over the next few years. But that's precisely the point.
They like the poetry.
And that is what comes up again. I would argue that is precisely what comes up again in the modernist form of an ethno-nationalist, ethno-linguistic nationalist movement of the Dravidianists, and how the Dravidianist paradigm also borrowed precisely on that poesy and rhetoricity that raised goosebumps on people, that attracted people not only because the ideas were very powerful, but also because the poesy was. That's why I liked very much your notion of intertextuality and also the notion of the fuzziness of these boundaries. There is a fuzziness. It's not simply there is a newness to modernity, but the mistake we've been making. And I think, and may I just thank Shelley Pollack, I think, for really, licensing us, I think, to see deep structures of things like nation states that could not have existed. If a nation state, as Anderson points out, it forms on the basis of circulation of vernacular print capital, we first had to have circulatory fields of social orders upon which that thing could have happened, and that very clearly happens in Tamil. Damn long time ago. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but certainly within the Chola period, it gels in a certain way that enables a new, Tamil idiom of political leadership to occur. But the point here is that it also, these things don't just get, modernized, de novo with a brand new soul. There is something, and I would say it's the thing that comes from the way that people recite poetry. And people tell stories that gets into a person's soul early on and actually structures emotional responses that we have. And that stuff is old. That's the point. Without getting into, and I want to be very careful not to be essentializing, but I think that stuff is really old, by the way. And has to do with poetry.
This is for David. I sensed you are very defensive about the taking of this novel, and why? Because I think G. Nagarajan has almost legendary status in modern poetry. Rokkiah publishing it in the early 90s itself. So there are two phases to this reputation. The early reputation was, because he was, when Jayaram was writing, romanticizing urban proletariat. Here he was, just depicting them very stark, sparse prose. In the 90s, that was the context in which this collected works was published. The moment I talked about the critical writing was coming up in new critical theories were being examined, the notion of rebellion was being ionized, and writing about margins. G. Nagarajan's book squarely fitted into that, and his own life. I really like the way you started your presentation with these three narratives by contemporary writers about him in the form of the stories. The reputation of G. Nagarajan was made not just by his writings and all, but the stories that separate value. For instance, he was supposed to have gone to no less than the Madurai Meenakshi temple and lighted a cigarette from the
chutzpah, we call it.
More than that, my goodness.
Narratives about almost every important Tamil writer that circulate. Right?
Just two minor points. One is I thought you were being very uncharitable to Maxim Gorky. The reason being that I find that whenever I come to the US or in UK, people give Gorky short script. Unfortunately, he has been identified so much with the mother, which is a very poor novel.
Yeah.
But his trilogy, his searing attack on American capitalism, the city of the world, is so much part of what they all do. And his story also was that he
This
came
is the
out
embodied
after
ground of the
State
CPM.
All-Star, 2 days of life. But in the late 60s, he wrote a short story about lesbian relationships. It was completely nobody would think of it. So in the 90s, he was rediscovered and was celebrated again. Finally, you mentioned this unpublished novel. I've read that novel, so I thought I should mention that. It's in two versions, both incomplete. So novel is called If Fate Conspire. It itself, shows, his deep reading into so many things. His allusion is very obvious. When I first get my hands on the novel, usually I'm very wary of, things that, legendary things passed by word of mouth about something being very great and not being published. You read it and it's a damn story, usually. But this, very interestingly, his command of the language is quite amazing. No cause for luscious stuff. It's very incomplete and it's transparently autobiographical. He was supposed to be a very good English teacher who taught him in tutorial colleges. And apparently in the cinema halls of Madurai, they would have slides which say that modern tutorials, G. Nagarajan takes classes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh. I just wanted to say, actually, thank you, Jalapati, and I'm glad to hear about the English novella, and I'm glad that you've seen it. And perhaps we should publish it, or do something about that. But
we are making arrangements.
You're doing it. That's good.
In English? It's incomplete. That is
But, in terms of being defensive, part of that comes from the fact that over the last 24, 48 hours, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who know the novel and have said to me, well, yeah, here's one of them. Yeah. Well, it's such a grim book, and I just couldn't bring myself to finish it. And I myself, I have to confess, when I first read it, and I read it for Abby's sake, only for Abby's sake, and I asked myself, why did she like this book? Why did she pick it? Now, I've read it by now maybe 3 or 4 times. And so by now, of course, I'm sort of immersed in it, and quite the contrary. Not only do I not feel defensive, I think it's actually a brilliant work, and somehow squarely set within the Tamil literary tradition in ways that are not obvious, perhaps. So, but anyway, I was perhaps reflecting the fact that I know in the room there are people who couldn't get through it. Right? I just want to say one other thing about Gorky, though, because I also grew up on Gorky, and I read him in Russian, and I think he's a terrible writer. There are certain books we read when we're, 18 or 17 or something like that. They're with us all our lives. Doesn't mean that they were great literature, right?
Yes, things became popular in India, which I don't know why they had that sudden life in India. And Maxim Gorky's mother was one of those, which just became part of the everybody's knowledge and reading.